Hi, welcome back to Space Thoughts. It's Sunday, it's April 5th, and this is actually our first full week with our stay-at-home order. I hope those of you who are in a similar situation are finding things to do and keeping busy and keeping sane. It's a beautiful day outside. I did step outside for a little bit and had to run a few essential errands this morning. So the weather's getting better, and hopefully we'll be through this pandemic situation in good order. I want to talk a little bit today about customary international law. And in previous videos and a lot of my writings, I talk about customary international law. And actually, I'm kind of really heavy on customary international law in my space law work because I think it's really critically important, not just in space law, but in international law in multiple domains, like the oceans, for example. Very, very important. And I just want to give you a kind of a rough explanation of what customary international law entails. And we're not going to get too complex because it's really opaque, and it's very subjective. It's a very subjective topic. So when I'm going to talk about customary international law, I'm talking about rulemaking through state actions that create legal precedent. Now there are two fundamental ways to create international law: through treaties and through custom. Now there are other methods of creating international law, but I'm not going to delve into it because I'd be here for hours trying to discuss it all. But I just want to give you a kind of a brief overview of what customary international law is all about. Custom is extremely important because it's one of those things that really, even when you have a treaty, it really doesn't go away because it's always lingering there in the background. And it's probably one of the most controversial areas to talk about because what creates custom? What is custom? How do you create it? And can you create it accidentally? And so I guess I'm just going to take a definition that I've been using a lot for my writings that basically defines customary international law. Now, basically, it's a two-tier analysis. In other words, first, there must be a consistent practice of states. In other words, this must be an action that states take on and they do it consistently. It doesn't necessarily do it once, but they do it consistently. And two, there must be a sense of legal obligation. Opinio juris necessitatis, okay? Opinion of law or necessity. In other words, when these actions that these states are taking, they must be considered legally necessary, or the states must consider it legally obligated to do so. And this is kind of the two-tier analysis that the courts do. And in fact, this definition, this test for customary international law is from the U.S. Federal Court from the 11th Circuit, and this is actually followed by all the circuits in the United States at this point. And I think it's a really, really good definition, a solid definition. In fact, this is used in the international level as well. However, there's one nuance that I really want to throw in here, and it's the third bullet I have here. The definition of customary international law is nuanced because not all states are equal when considering whether a state's practice reaches the level of customary international law. And this is kind of in what I think, and this is my personal opinion, a lot of people don't agree with it, this is what I think is really a third prong or a third part of the test for customary international law. Now, I get a lot of pushback because the textbooks and the treatises and scholars say, well, there's only two prongs to the test for customary international law. I'm saying that I think this right here, this nuance here, is actually a third prong that has to be applied. And it's really the third prong that is tricky. So let me give me an example, and I'll use outer space since outer space is a good example of that nuance. Now, let's take the launch of Sputnik 1, for example. Sputnik 1 created the customary international law or rule of free access in outer space. And when that happened, when they launched it, basically, the U.S. used that launch to say, "Oh, wait a minute, this is a state practice," and the state felt legally obligated to this, and the U.S. and actually the Soviet Union repeated that, and then the U.S. actually launched a satellite in orbit and kind of solidified that customary norm through there. Now, at that time, both the U.S. and the Soviet Union were the two premier nations or states for space exploration. They were the ones who had the most prestige in the field. So really, they have what I call is the juice in the international community to make this international norm stick. Now, if there had been another country, say for example, a South American country or a nation that had no spacefaring capabilities at that time, if they had declared free access of outer space at that time without any action and just kind of declared it out there, they probably wouldn't have the juice to really make it stick. It probably wouldn't have been custom. And actually a good example of that is the Bogota Declaration in the 1970s, where basically a bunch of countries along the equator basically claimed as their territory geosynchronous orbit, and they made this proclamation, and what they were trying to do is they were trying to make it customary international law. But they really didn't have the juice to make it stick because they weren't spacefaring nations. And on top of that, the rest of the world kind of came in and opposed that idea and pushed back really hard on it. And that's the funny thing, and that's the thing about customary international law, and getting back to my Sputnik definition, if there had been pushback by the Soviet Union on the U.S. claim to free access, it might have had a little bit more difficulty actually becoming custom. Although through their actions, through their overt actions of orbiting a satellite, they basically didn't have a legal argument for it. So basically, that's stuck as customary international law. I think a more recent example, and I talked about this, I think it was last month, was basically the MEV project up in space that actually rendezvoused with an Intel satellite and is servicing it. Basically, that is in the process of setting a customary rule of customary international law, that activity, in that, this is a new activity, it's never been done before, and it's kind of setting the precedent for it in regards to, this will be an accepted practice in customary international law. What I'm saying is, unless there's significant pushback by other spacefaring nations, it probably will become a customary rule of international law that this type of activity is acceptable. And that might translate into what I call a norm. And I've mentioned norms before. I'm not going to get into norms today because that's a whole another topic that's complicated, just like everything else in international law. But anyways, so far with the MEV program, there's been no pushback on the international front, so it's probably going to be okay, and probably get some sort of status as customary international law. Another domain to talk about is the South China Sea, where the PRC is basically making claims to man-made islands and extending sovereignty. One of the problems with that is it's abrogating free access of the oceans, and that actually contravenes UNCLOS. And the problem is, if these activities, the more they're accepted and the less pushback they get, if that continues to evolve, they could develop a customary rule of international law that you can actually build these islands and create, sovereign spaces around in the open ocean, and basically deny free access in certain areas of the ocean. So that is, something to consider as well, and that's the use of custom. Custom is very important. In fact, during the beginning of the space age, the Air Force was very up on letting international space law progress through custom. But President Eisenhower wanted to go the Outer Space Treaty route, and eventually he won out, and we got the Outer Space Treaty, which actually the idea of free access to outer space has kind of merged into the Outer Space Treaty. And you find that a lot of customary rules actually find themselves in formal treaties sometimes. But right now, treaties are one of those things that aren't really in vogue right now, and really we're going back to the beginning, and customary international law is becoming more of the path of creating new space law. Like I talked about the MEV and the Intelsat rendezvous up in orbit there. That's an example right there. So I think you're going to see more customary international law forming international space law, as opposed to any new treaties or amending any treaties. And of course, you're going to see interpretation of the other treaties, which is a kind of a whole other topic altogether. But anyways, that is a rough and tumble description of customary international law. I mean, it's about as brief as I can be without it getting too complex, but it gives you an idea what I'm talking about when I talk about customary international law in my prior videos, and what I'll be talking to you about customary international law in future videos. So anyways, I hope you have a good day. Let's hold out. We're going to get through this, and have a great day, and we'll talk to you next time.